The axe came down with a sickening crack against my waterline. "Your farm days are over, Johnson," shouted the HOA president, designer suit splattered with mud, orange hard hat askew as water erupted from my severed irrigation pipe. I had 30 years of sweat in this Texas soil, but in that moment, watching this city lawyer destroy my livelihood, I knew only one of us would survive this war. She thought her HOA millions made her untouchable. Would you let someone with an axe and a grudge destroy everything your family built for generations? My name is Robert Johnson, though most locals call me Old Man Johnson. These days, a nickname I've earned at 55 years old after working every inch of this 120-acre farm outside Austin, Texas, since 1985. This land isn't just property to me. It's my wife Martha's family blood and heritage. Sacred soil passed down through 4 generations of Texas farmers who refused to surrender it through the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and every challenge since. Martha's grandfather first broke this soil with nothing but a mule and determination in 1932, and her father spent 2 years teaching me his hard-earned wisdom about coaxing life from this land before giving me his blessing to marry his daughter and carry on the family legacy. Every callus on my hands tells a story of this farm's journey from struggling homestead to something remarkable. Martha and I raised our 3 children among these fields, watching them learn to crawl on the same porch where their grandmother took her first steps. While neighboring farms sold out to developers one by one, we transformed ours into something special: organic certification, heritage vegetables, Texas peaches so sweet they brought chefs from Austin's finest farm-to-table restaurants driving out weekly to secure their supply. We invented new irrigation techniques during the worst droughts, devised drainage systems through biblical floods, and created direct-to-consumer programs during economic downturns. This farm hasn't just survived, it's evolved and thrived against every odds, becoming a landmark that many Austin residents could identify by name alone. When we started, our nearest neighbor was old Jake Harmon, whose farm was a good mile down the road. We shared equipment, helped each other during harvest, and traded produce. That's how farming communities operated, with mutual respect and support. The county recognized us as an essential agricultural enterprise, granting us special water rights during the 1990s drought that saved not just our farm, but several others in the area. Our children grew up understanding the rhythm of the seasons, the value of hard work, and the satisfaction of growing food that nourished their community. Our oldest daughter, Sarah, became an agricultural economist. Our son Michael teaches sustainable farming practices at Texas A&M. Our youngest, Emma, initially moved to Houston for a corporate career, but recently returned with her children, hoping they could experience the same connection to the land she had growing up. This family legacy seemed secure until 5 years ago, when everything changed with the arrival of Metrolux development. It started with surveyors placing stakes along the property adjacent to my eastern boundary, land that had belonged to the Davidson family for generations until their children decided to sell after their parents passed. I thought nothing of it until the bulldozers arrived, clearing 200 acres of native Texas oaks and pecan trees in a matter of weeks. Metrolux Development had purchased the land for $15 million and secured permits to build Meadowbrook Estates, an exclusive gated community with homes starting at $750,000. Their marketing materials promised country living with city luxury and pastoral views, ironically, views of my farm that they would soon try to eliminate. The construction was relentless, 7 days a week, from dawn until dusk. Dust coated my crops, requiring additional irrigation to wash them clean. The wildlife that had previously moved freely between our properties became disoriented, with deer damaging my fences as they sought new pathways through their disrupted habitat. I approached the construction supervisor, a reasonable man named Luis, who apologized and agreed to implement dust control measures. He also arranged more mindful construction hours, avoiding the early mornings when my crops needed harvesting. This professional courtesy, unfortunately, would prove to be the exception rather than the rule in my dealings with Meadowbrook Estates. Within 8 months, the first residents began moving in. Initially, many seemed genuinely interested in living near a working farm. Young families brought children to my weekend farm stand to see where their food came from. A few retirees even asked if they could volunteer during harvest, reminiscing about their own rural childhoods. But as more homes were occupied, the demographics shifted. Wealthy professionals from California, New York, and Chicago arrived, people who wanted the idea of country living but were unprepared for the realities of sharing space with agricultural operations. The first confrontation came 3 months after Meadowbrook Estates reached 50% occupancy. A certified letter arrived from a newly formed homeowners association, bearing the first of what would become an orchestrated campaign of complaints. According to this initial grievance, my tractor, essential farm equipment I'd used daily for decades, now constituted an aesthetic violation of their community's standards simply by being visible from their access road. They strongly suggested I construct a storage building to shield my equipment from view, a demand both impractical and indicative of their fundamental misunderstanding of agricultural operations. I responded politely but firmly, explaining that my property predated their development by decades and was not subject to their HOA regulations. I invited their board to visit the farm to better understand agricultural operations, hoping education might bridge the growing divide. Only one board member accepted, James Cooper, a retired engineer who had grown up on a Missouri farm. After touring my operation, he understood the impracticality of hiding essential equipment that needed daily access. He promised to explain this to the others, and for a brief period, the complaints subsided. The clash escalated dramatically when I scheduled my seasonal application of organic compost, a critical practice for maintaining soil health without chemical fertilizers. Patricia strategically timed her response, waiting until this agricultural necessity coincided with Meadowbrook's community pool opening to maximize resident complaints. The HOA immediately filed a formal complaint with the county, dramatically characterizing the natural process as noxious odors creating serious health concerns for residents. The county's response dealt the HOA its first official rejection. Their agricultural inspector not only found my practices well within regulations, but specifically commended my sustainable approach as exemplary for the region. Going further, he issued a formal letter reinforcing my right to farm status, a robust legal protection in Texas specifically designed to shield established agricultural operations from nuisance complaints when new developments encroach. I posted this official notice prominently in my property line, believing naively that regulatory confirmation might matter. I would soon learn that for Patricia, legal boundaries were merely obstacles to overcome, not limits to respect. Instead, it only seemed to escalate the situation. The HOA began contacting me about noise from my irrigation pumps, which occasionally ran during night hours to minimize water evaporation during the Texas heat. Though completely legal, I adjusted the schedule where possible, demonstrating good faith despite having no obligation to do so. 18 months after Meadowbrook's completion, their annual HOA meeting brought a leadership change that would transform this neighborhood annoyance into something far more sinister. Patricia Williams, a retired corporate attorney from San Francisco who had purchased one of the largest homes backing directly onto my property, was elected HOA president by a narrow margin. Patricia had made her fortune representing technology companies in Silicon Valley, specializing in aggressive litigation strategies that forced smaller competitors into costly legal battles they couldn't sustain. She brought this same ruthless approach to her new role. Within her first week as president, Patricia called an emergency board meeting specifically about the farm situation. Through Kevin Zhao, the HOA's IT consultant who would later become my unlikely ally, I later obtained the minutes from this closed-door session. The continued operation of an active farm adjacent to our luxury development is incompatible with our community vision and my personal standards, Patricia had declared. Previous boards have been too accommodating. I moved here from San Francisco for an exclusive resort-like environment, not to live next to tractors and livestock. We need to take decisive action to enforce the pristine aesthetic I envisioned when purchasing my home. The board discussed various strategies, from continuous regulatory complaints to exploiting water usage regulations. Patricia even suggested secretly recording my farm operations to find violations we can leverage. Most disturbingly, she floated the idea of pooling resources to make an offer on my property at 40% below market value, with the clear implication that they would make my life difficult until I accepted. James Cooper, the sole dissenting voice, argued that my farm actually enhanced their community's appeal and suggested partnership opportunities instead. He was promptly removed from the landscaping committee he had previously chaired. Patricia's crusade began with a barrage of county complaints about dust, noise, odors, and alleged water contamination. Each required inspections that disrupted my operations. Though I passed every inspection, the constant interruptions took a toll on productivity and my peace of mind. She then escalated to attending county water board meetings, challenging my irrigation permits with spurious claims about excessive usage. The Water Authority representatives repeatedly explained that agricultural water allocations were separate from residential supplies and that my consumption was well within approved limits. Frustrated by bureaucratic channels that wouldn't bend to her will, Patricia switched tactics in a way that should have warned me of how far she would eventually go. The first sign of Patricia's new strategy appeared on the Meadowbrook Estates community Facebook page, which she now controlled as HOA president. Patricia posted misleading close-up photographs of normal agricultural equipment with captions suggesting they were industrial hazards and aesthetic blights, threatening what she called the resort-quality ambience she had promised incoming residents. When residents questioned these characterizations, Patricia claimed she had consulted experts who confirmed these concerns. No such experts were ever identified. The online campaign soon moved offline. Meadowbrook residents began finding glossy flyers in their mailboxes with alarming headlines. Is your family safe from agricultural chemicals? And property values plummet near active farms. The flyers featured generic stock photos of industrial farming operations bearing no resemblance to my small-scale organic farm. These materials directed concerned residents to attend HOA meetings where Patricia presented misleading claims about incompatible rural activities in what she repeatedly called our luxury enclave. Her presentations focused obsessively on what she termed visual standards of excellence and her personal vision for transforming Meadowbrook into what she called the premier address in the county. When questioned about actual community benefits of neighboring farms, she would dismiss them as irrelevant to my vision for our community. More troubling were Patricia's claims about my farming practices. She alleged I was using dangerous pesticides that threatened Meadowbrook's groundwater, despite my farm having organic certification for over a decade. She suggested my irrigation methods were wasteful and outdated, though I had recently invested in a state-of-the-art drip system that conservation experts considered exemplary. These false claims might have convinced the entire community, if not for residents like Eleanor and George Simmons, a retired couple who had specifically purchased Meadowbrook because they valued living near a working farm. Eleanor had grown up on a farm in East Texas and recognized Patricia's descriptions as fabrications. This isn't right. Eleanor Simmons stood up at one particularly contentious meeting, her voice quiet but firm as she addressed the assembled residents. The retired schoolteacher commanded immediate attention, being widely respected in the community for her thoughtful approach to neighborhood issues. I've walked the perimeter path beside Mr. Johnson's farm every morning for 2 years. The sustainable, carefully maintained operation I've observed bears absolutely no resemblance to the industrial hazard being described in these presentations. Rather than trying to drive away a fourth-generation farmer, we should recognize the extraordinary privilege of having fresh, local, organic produce available within walking distance, something most communities would consider a premier amenity rather than a problem. Her challenge sparked a divide in the community. About a third of the residents, many of them older and with rural backgrounds, formed an informal alliance called Farm-Friendly Neighbors. They began attending HOA meetings specifically to counter Patricia's claims with facts and personal observations. This resistance only made Patricia more determined. At the next board meeting, she proposed allocating $100,000 from the HOA's reserve fund for legal actions to address the farm situation. Despite objections from several members, The motion passed by a single vote. Nature soon provided Patricia with a new angle of attack. Texas entered one of its worst droughts in decades, with water restrictions imposed across multiple counties. Residential users faced strict limitations on lawn watering and car washing, while agricultural operations received modified restrictions that allowed for essential crop maintenance. This differential treatment, though necessary for food security, became Patricia's rallying cry. At a town hall meeting about water conservation, she publicly confronted me in front of local officials and news cameras. How is it fair that our luxury community must conserve water while Mr. Johnson continues his outdated rural activities next door? She demanded, her voice carrying the distinct contempt of someone who viewed agriculture as beneath her status. I didn't leave my executive position in San Francisco to live next to farm animals and tractors. Our children deserve a pristine, resort-quality environment, not to witness daily reminders of manual labor and livestock. Her outburst revealed her true motivation, not practical concerns about water, but deep-seated elitism and disdain for the rural lifestyle my farm represented. The Water Authority representative patiently explained that agricultural water allocations were entirely separate from residential supplies, drawing from different sources and delivery systems. He also pointed out that my farm's water efficiency metrics exceeded county standards, thanks to my recent irrigation system upgrades. Farms like Mr. Johnson's are essential to our local food security, he explained. During crises like this drought, having productive agricultural operations within our community becomes even more critical. This public correction should have settled the matter, but it only humiliated and further enraged Patricia. The following week, anonymous calls began flooding various regulatory agencies, triggering a cascade of surprise inspections of my farm. Each inspection disrupted operations during critical growing periods, though I passed every one without citations. These harassment tactics took a personal toll. At 68, the stress of constantly defending my livelihood affected my health. I developed insomnia and high blood pressure, conditions I'd never experienced in decades of physically demanding farm work. Martha worried as she watched me check and recheck our regulatory compliance late into the night, preparing for inspections that could come at any moment. The situation reached a critical point when I received a certified letter from a law firm representing the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. They claimed my irrigation system encroached on their property by 4 inches at one boundary point and demanded immediate removal or face legal action. The letter included a survey supposedly confirming this encroachment. I hired my own surveyor, who confirmed my system was entirely within my property boundaries. When I submitted these findings to the HOA's attorney, they simply responded that they disagreed with the methodology and reiterated their demands. This pattern of escalating harassment made clear that Patricia and her allies wouldn't stop until they forced me to sell. What I couldn't have anticipated was how far they would go to achieve this goal. July 15th began like any summer day on the farm. I woke at 4:30 a.m., checked weather forecasts, and headed out to activate the irrigation system for our tomato fields, which were at a critical fruiting stage. When I turned the main valve, nothing happened. No water pressure registered on the gauges. I followed the main supply line from my fields back toward the county connection point, checking for obvious leaks or blockages. As I approached the property boundary near Meadowbrook Estates, I heard the unmistakable sound of running water and a woman's voice cursing loudly. Rounding a bend in the access path, I encountered a scene so shocking I initially thought I must be misunderstanding what I was seeing. There stood Patricia Williams, wearing a business skirt and blouse incongruously paired with an orange construction hard hat and reflective vest. She stood knee-deep in a freshly dug pit beside my main water line, which was now spouting water from multiple axe cuts. The ground around her was a muddy mess as thousands of gallons of precious water my crops desperately needed during the drought, poured into the dirt. In her hands was a firefighter's axe, raised above her head as she prepared to strike the pipe again. Her designer clothes were splattered with mud, her face contorted with rage and exertion. "Your farm days are over, Johnson," she shouted when she saw me, so caught up in her destructive frenzy that she didn't even attempt to hide her actions or intentions. I immediately pulled out my phone and began recording, keeping a safe distance as Patricia continued her assault on my water line. "What are you doing? That's a county water line. It's a felony to tamper with it," I called out, trying to reason with her despite my shock. "This illegal connection is stealing community water during a drought," she shouted back, swinging the axe again. "The board authorized me to take necessary action to protect our neighborhood resources." Her claim was absurd. My connection was fully permitted, with documentation on file with the County Water Authority. As I continued filming, I called both the Sheriff's Department and the Water Authority emergency line, clearly stating that someone was actively damaging a permitted water line. When Patricia realized I was recording and calling authorities, she became even more enraged. She climbed out of the pit and began advancing toward me, axe still in hand. "Give me that phone," she demanded, forcing me to retreat to my truck for safety. I locked myself in and continued recording as Patricia returned to the damaged pipe, inflicting several more blows before the sound of approaching sirens finally gave her pause. As sheriff's deputies arrived, I watched in disbelief as Patricia's demeanor transformed. She set down the axe, straightened her hard hat, and adopted a calm, professional manner. Sheriff Martinez approached cautiously, taking in the bizarre scene. "What's happening here, folks?" he asked, eyeing the geyser of water still erupting from the damaged pipe. Patricia immediately launched into a prepared explanation. "I'm Patricia Williams, president of Meadowbrook Estates, HOA," she said with remarkable composure. "We received reports of water pressure issues affecting our community. While inspecting this connection, which we believe may be unauthorized, Mr. Johnson became confrontational and threatening." "That's completely false," I replied, immediately showing Sheriff Martinez the video on my phone. As you can see, Ms. Williams was actively destroying my water line with an axe when I arrived. I have all the proper permits for this connection, which you can verify with the County Water Authority. The Water Authority representative arrived moments later, confirming my water rights were in perfect order and expressing alarm at the extent of the damage. "This connection serves a protected agricultural operation," he explained to the deputies. "Tampering with it is a serious offense, especially during drought conditions." Patricia's composed facade crumbled as she realized her position was untenable. "You don't understand," she insisted, her voice rising. "His farm is destroying our property values. We've tried every legal channel and gotten nowhere." As deputies led Patricia to a patrol car, she called out to me, "This isn't over, Johnson. The HOA has deeper pockets than you can imagine. We'll bury you in legal fees until you have no choice but to sell." Her parting threat, captured clearly on the deputies' body cameras, would prove to be a critical mistake. While Patricia was being processed at the county jail on charges of criminal damage to property, trespassing, and making false statements to law enforcement, I faced the immediate crisis of my damaged water supply. With temperatures forecast to reach 102 degrees Fahrenheit in the coming days, my crops would quickly wither without irrigation. The County Water Authority fast-tracked emergency repairs, but even working around the clock, it would take at least 48 hours to restore regular water service. I began calling neighboring farmers to borrow portable water tanks, a stopgap measure that might save at least part of my crop. As I worked the phones, a silver Tesla pulled up my driveway. A young man in his 30s stepped out, looking nervously over his shoulder before approaching me. "Mr. Johnson?" The young man approached cautiously, glancing over his shoulder toward the main entrance to Meadowbrook. He seemed nervous, dressed in a casual tech industry style that contrasted with the formal business attire Patricia favored for HOA functions. "I'm Kevin Zhao, the IT systems administrator for Meadowbrook Estates. What happened today with your water line wasn't an impulsive act of frustration. I've uncovered digital evidence proving they've been methodically planning this sabotage for months through encrypted board communications." Kevin explained that as the external contractor managing Meadowbrook's digital systems, he had access to their cloud storage, email archives, and meeting recordings. "I've been uncomfortable with what I've been seeing in their communications, but today's events crossed a line I can't ignore." Kevin handed me a flash drive, his expression grim. This contains documented evidence that will shock you. Meeting minutes they thought were deleted, email threads they believed were private, and most damning of all, recorded video conferences where Patricia and key board members explicitly mapped out strategies to damage your irrigation infrastructure. Their planning was meticulous, calculating exactly when to strike during peak growing season to maximize crop loss. Their financial models predicted precisely how many weeks of irrigation disruption would be required to push your operation into insolvency, forcing you to accept their below-market buyout offer. I was stunned. Why are you sharing this with me? Won't this put your contract at risk? Kevin's expression was resolute. My parents were rice farmers in California before they lost their land to developers using similar tactics. I can't be part of this happening to another family. Besides, I'm an independent contractor. My agreement doesn't include covering up potential crimes. The flash drive contained over 200 documents detailing the HOA's systematic campaign against my farm. Most damning was an email chain titled Water Pressure Strategy, where Patricia explicitly wrote, "If legal means won't remove this eyesore, perhaps a water accident during peak growing season might make Johnson reconsider our offer. The board needs to be prepared to approve emergency funds for any infrastructure issues that might arise at our perimeter." 5 board members had responded affirmatively, effectively approving the strategy. Only James Cooper had objected, writing, "This crosses both legal and ethical lines. I want my opposition formally noted." He was removed from the email chain shortly afterward. Kevin also provided access credentials for the HOA's cloud storage, where I found recordings of 3 board meetings where they discussed the water sabotage plan in explicit detail. In a most recent meeting, just 2 days before the incident, Patricia could be heard saying, "The drought provides perfect cover. Everyone's having water issues right now. One more incident won't raise suspicions." As I stared at the evidence Kevin had provided, the full picture finally came into focus. What I'd been experiencing wasn't simply harassment or vandalism, but something far more calculated. The axe in Patricia's hands hadn't been wielded by an impulsive individual. It had been the final execution of a documented conspiracy, methodically planned and formally approved by wealthy, powerful people who believed their position placed them above accountability. The board minutes transformed what might have been dismissed as property damage into something prosecutors would recognize immediately. Criminal conspiracy with multiple knowing participants who had approved and facilitated sabotage using HOA resources. With neighboring farmers now helping address my immediate water crisis, the Hendersons lending portable irrigation tanks while the Martins adjusted their schedule to share water access, I could finally look beyond the immediate crop emergency toward justice. The flash drive in my hand represented not just evidence, but a turning point that would require legal expertise beyond what I could navigate alone. The next morning, on the recommendation of 3 separate farmer advocacy organizations, I found myself sitting across from Michael Ramirez, an attorney whose reputation for fighting HOA overreach had made him something of a legend among property rights defenders in Central Texas. As Michael reviewed the documents and recordings, his expression shifted from professional interest to unmistakable determination. This goes far beyond typical neighbor disputes or even standard HOA harassment, he explained, scrolling through the emails. What we have here is conspiracy, criminal property damage, tortious interference with business, and potentially even racketeering under Texas law. The HOA used their organizational structure and resources to plan and execute actions specifically designed to cause you financial harm. Michael recommended filing for an emergency injunction to prevent further interference with my farm operations while preparing a comprehensive civil lawsuit against both Patricia Williams individually and the Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, as an entity. With the evidence we have, we can seek compensatory damages for your current losses, plus punitive damages for their deliberate misconduct, he explained. And since they used HOA meetings, communications, and resources to orchestrate this, their insurance and collective assets are potentially liable. We immediately filed for the emergency injunction, which a judge granted within 24 hours, a crucial victory that prohibited any HOA representative from approaching within 100 feet of my water infrastructure or irrigation systems. Next, we prepared a civil complaint detailing the full scope of harassment, from the initial nuisance complaints through the escalating campaign of regulatory harassment, culminating in the deliberate sabotage. The complaint named Patricia Williams, all 5 board members who had approved the water strategy, and the HOA itself as defendants. When served with the lawsuit, the HOA's initial response came through their attorney, Bradford Wells, a corporate litigator known for aggressive defense strategies. He dismissed our claims as entirely without merit and suggested my lawsuit was an opportunistic attempt to extract money from an affluent community by a failing agricultural operation. This public statement, issued to local media, constituted defamation given my farm's documented profitability and organic certification. We immediately amended our complaint to include this new cause of action. Bradford's strategy reflected a fundamental miscalculation. He assumed this was a standard dispute where an individual farmer could be outspent and outlasted by a wealthy HOA's legal resources. He didn't understand that the evidence we possessed, particularly the recorded meetings and email chains explicitly discussing criminal sabotage, had fundamentally altered the legal landscape. When Bradford finally reviewed the full evidence during discovery, he requested an emergency meeting. His settlement offer of $250,000 came with a confidentiality agreement that would prevent any public disclosure of the HOA's actions. Michael slid the settlement proposal across his desk, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. $250,000, he said, tapping the figure on the page. They're terrified, Robert. This offer isn't negotiation, it's panic. They started by trying to bankrupt you, and now they're desperately throwing money at their problem. He leaned forward, voice lowering confidentially. But here's your first victory. This proposal proves they know they're defeated. Their lawyers have seen our evidence and recognized it's catastrophic to their defense. They're not just facing civil penalties, there are potential criminal conspiracy charges awaiting multiple board members. That's why they've included this extensive confidentiality clause. But no private agreement can shield them from the district attorney once these recordings become evidence. The settlement offer represented my first concrete victory, tangible proof that the power dynamic had completely reversed. I could take their money and walk away financially whole. The thought was momentarily tempting after months of stress and uncertainty. But as I stared at the paper, I remembered my father-in-law's words decades ago when developers had first approached him. This land isn't just dirt and crops, Robert. It's a trust passed from one generation to the next. I pushed the settlement back across the desk. Not interested, I said firmly. This was never about money. It's about justice, about establishing that wealthy newcomers can't simply erase generations of agricultural heritage when it doesn't suit their aesthetic preferences. I need a verdict that ensures I can continue my family's farming legacy without fear of further sabotage, harassment, or someone else trying the same tactics in the future. 3 weeks before a trial date, I received an unexpected call from California. Mr. Johnson, my name is Diane Foster. I worked as Patricia Williams' executive assistant at her law firm in San Francisco for 8 years. I've been following what's happening in Texas, and there's information you should know. Diane explained that Patricia's actions against my farm weren't an isolated incident. At her San Francisco law firm, Patricia had established a reputation for using aggressive, sometimes questionable tactics against opponents. Most relevantly, she had orchestrated a similar campaign against a family-owned grocery store that competed with a national chain represented by her firm. She used the same playbook, Diane explained. First regulatory complaints, then public smear campaigns about health concerns, and finally, when those didn't work, there was an accident with their refrigeration system that destroyed their inventory during their busiest season. They couldn't recover financially and eventually sold to her client at a fraction of the property's value. Diane had documentation, emails, meeting notes, and internal memos showing Patricia's direct involvement in that campaign. She had kept these records after leaving the firm because she'd been troubled by the ethical implications. Now, seeing similar tactics employed against my farm, she felt compelled to come forward. "I was complicit by staying silent before," she said. "I don't want that on my conscience again." Michael immediately filed to add Diane as a witness in our case, submitting her evidence under seal to the court. When Bradford Wells learned about this new testimony, the HOA's position weakened significantly. Their settlement offer increased to $500,000, then $750,000, but I continued to refuse. The community needed to see the full extent of what had transpired. Most unexpectedly, two current Meadowbrook residents, James Cooper, the board member who had objected to the sabotage plan, and Eleanor Simmons from the Farm-Friendly Neighbors group, came forward to testify on my behalf. They described the systematic campaign against my farm and how dissenting voices within the community had been silenced or marginalized. Their courage in standing against their own HOA, knowing they would continue living in the community regardless of the outcome, added powerful credibility to our case. The courthouse steps swarmed with reporters when our trial began. Camera crews lined the entrance, competing for shots of Patricia and her HOA allies as they arrived in luxury vehicles, contrasted with my weather pickup truck. Within minutes of the judge entering, it became clear this wasn't just another property dispute. It had exploded into a symbolic battle between Texas agricultural heritage and encroaching urban wealth. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with many reporters left standing along the back wall, notebooks in hand. Bradford Wells strode to the center of the courtroom with practiced confidence, his $3,000 suit and manicured appearance embodying everything his clients represented. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with theatrical sympathy, "what we have here is regrettable but straightforward." Ms. Williams, overwhelmed by community responsibilities and legitimate water concerns during a crippling drought, had a momentary lapse of judgment. One person, one impulsive action, nothing more. To suggest this represented Meadowbrook Estates policy would be like blaming an entire family when one child misbehaves. Michael waited until Bradford returned to his seat, then approached the jury without notes or flashy gestures. The courtroom fell silent as he simply tapped his tablet. The massive screen behind him illuminated with Patricia's own words. "If legal means won't remove this eyesore, perhaps a water accident during peak growing season might make Johnson reconsider our offer." Michael let the words hang in the air before tapping again, revealing video footage of board members nodding approval as Patricia detailed precisely how many days without irrigation would force me into financial ruin. "This wasn't impulsive," Michael said quietly, letting their own documented conspiracy speak for itself. "This was calculated destruction, planned in board meetings, approved by votes, and executed with precision during the most damaging possible moment. This was corporate strategy applied to eliminate a neighboring business. This case isn't about a single person's actions," he told the jury. "It's about a calculated conspiracy by wealthy individuals who believed their property values mattered more than a family's generational legacy and livelihood. They tried every legal avenue to remove Mr. Johnson's farm, and when those failed, they deliberately crossed into criminal territory. The evidence presentation was systematic. First came the progression of harassment, established through the series of meritless complaints and regulatory challenges. Then the documentation of the conspiracy itself, including emails, meeting recordings, and witness testimony from Kevin Zhao about the digital evidence he had discovered. Patricia's testimony proved particularly damaging to the defense. Under Michael's cross-examination, she repeatedly contradicted herself about her actions and intentions. When confronted with her own recorded statements about timing the water sabotage for maximum crop damage, she claimed they were hypothetical discussions rather than actual plans. Was swinging an axe at Mr. Johnson's water line also hypothetical, Ms. Williams? Michael asked, as the courtroom video played her shouting, "Your farm days are over, Johnson." The most powerful testimony came from unexpected sources. Diane Foster described the similar tactics Patricia had employed in California, establishing a pattern of behavior that contradicted the defense's claim of an impulsive, isolated incident. James Cooper's testimony as a former HOA board member provided crucial insider confirmation. I objected to these plans from the beginning and was systematically excluded from discussions, he explained. When I threatened to alert Mr. Johnson about what they were planning, I was told my own property would become a regulatory focus if I didn't remain silent. Eleanor Simmons then described how the majority of Meadowbrook residents had never supported the campaign against my farm. Most of us moved there specifically because we valued having local agriculture nearby, she testified. The board acted without truly representing the community's wishes, using our HOA fees to finance a personal vendetta. My daughter Sarah, the agricultural economist, provided expert testimony on the financial impact of the water sabotage. This wasn't just about the immediate crop loss, she explained, displaying charts showing projections. The disruption occurred during a critical fruiting phase for multiple crops. The compound effect on annual revenue exceeds $380,000, with potential long-term customer relationship damages that are harder to quantify, but equally significant. The defense attempted to counter with their own experts, claiming my farm was already facing financial challenges unrelated to their actions, but cross-examination revealed these experts had never actually visited my operation or reviewed my complete financial records. As the trial neared conclusion, Bradford Wells made one final attempt to minimize damages, arguing that while the HOA's actions were perhaps overzealous, the actual proven damages were limited to the immediate repair costs and lost crop value. Michael's closing argument refuted this directly. The defendants didn't just damage a pipe, he told the jury. They attempted to destroy a family's livelihood and legacy, a farm that has fed this community for generations. They did so deliberately, with extensive planning, using the collective resources of their homeowners association to target a neighbor who simply wanted to continue the agricultural tradition his family had maintained for decades. After just 3 hours of deliberation, remarkably brief for a case of this complexity, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Hernandez asked the foreperson to read their findings. On all counts, the jury found in my favor. They determined that Patricia Williams, 5 HOA board members, and the Meadowbrook Estates HOA itself were liable for conspiracy, property damage, tortious interference with business, defamation, and harassment. For compensatory damages, the jury awarded $380,000, the full amount our agricultural economist had calculated for crop losses and business disruption. They added $28,000 for water infrastructure repairs and $75,000 for emotional distress, bringing the compensatory total to $483,000. Then came the punitive damages, $4.7 million. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. The jury had sent a clear message about the seriousness with which they viewed the HOA's conduct. The jury foreperson later explained their reasoning to reporters. We calculated the punitive damages based on what we believed would actually impact a wealthy HOA's future behavior. They discussed using their financial resources to bury Mr. Johnson in legal fees until he was forced to sell his family legacy. We wanted to ensure that no homeowners association in Texas would ever consider using their collective power to target neighboring properties in this manner again. Bradford Wells immediately announced their intention to appeal, claiming the punitive damages were grossly excessive and disproportionate. Judge Hernandez, however, denied their motion to stay the judgment during appeal. The evidence of premeditated malice in this case is overwhelming, she stated for the record. Given the defendant's explicit discussions about using financial pressure to force the plaintiff to sell his property, the court finds it appropriate to require the full judgment amount to be placed in escrow during any appeal process. This ruling was the final blow to the HOA's strategy. They had assumed their superior financial resources would allow them to extend the legal battle indefinitely. Instead, they now face the immediate reality of having to secure nearly $5.2 million while their appeal proceeded. The financial implications for Meadowbrook Estates were immediate and severe. Their HOA insurance policy capped liability coverage at $1 million, leaving them $4.2 million short. Their reserve fund contained only $800,000, meaning they needed to raise the remaining $3.4 million directly from homeowners. This translated to a special assessment of $45,333 per household across the 75 homes in the development. The HOA board attempted to structure payment plans, but their bylaws required the full assessment amount to be secured within 60 days of the judgment. The community erupted in outrage, not directed at me, but at Patricia Williams and the board members who had approved the sabotage plan. An emergency community meeting became so heated that security was called when one homeowner attempted to physically confront Patricia. "You've bankrupted us over your personal vendetta," shouted Dr. Richard Martinez, a retired surgeon whose home backed onto my farm. "I specifically bought here because I wanted to see farmland from my porch, not another cookie-cutter house. Now I'm facing a $45,000 bill because you couldn't respect a farm that was here long before any of us." Within days, the entire HOA board resigned. 8 homeowners immediately put their properties on the market, further depressing the very property values Patricia had claimed to be protecting. 3 board members who had approved the water sabotage plan quietly listed their homes with out-of-state realtors, attempting to sell before the full financial impact hit. In a particularly ironic twist, the new real estate listings prominently featured views of neighboring historic farms as a selling point, with several specifically mentioning organic produce available within walking distance as a community benefit. Patricia faced additional consequences beyond the civil judgment. The district attorney pursued criminal charges for the waterline sabotage, resulting in a conviction for criminal mischief, trespassing, and making false statements to law enforcement. Rather than jail time, she received 5 years of probation, a $75,000 fine, and was ordered to perform 200 hours of community service at the regional food bank that distributed produce from local farms, including mine. Most significantly, the court ordered her to complete an environmental conservation course focusing on sustainable agriculture and water resource management. The judge's statement at sentencing was pointed. "Perhaps with education will come understanding of the vital role agricultural operations play in our community, particularly during times of environmental stress." 3 months after the verdict, the newly elected Meadowbrook HOA board approached me with a genuine olive branch. Led by Eleanor Simmons and James Cooper, they proposed a formal cooperation agreement between the community and my farm. "What happened was inexcusable," Eleanor stated at our first meeting. "The new board wants to rebuild this relationship from the ground up, based on mutual respect and appreciation for what your farm brings to our community." Their proposal included creating a community-supported agriculture program where Meadowbrook residents could purchase seasonal shares of my produce. They also suggested establishing an educational garden space at the boundary between our properties, where residents, particularly retirees and families with children, could learn about sustainable farming practices. Most surprisingly, they proposed amending their HOA covenant to formally recognize and protect the adjacent agricultural operation, my farm, as a community asset. This amendment would prevent any future board from reviving the harassment campaign Patricia had initiated. After careful consideration, I accepted their proposal. The Meadowbrook Farm Partnership Program launched the following spring, with over 40 households participating in the CSA program. The educational garden became so popular that there was a waiting list for the volunteer positions. As for the judgment money, after paying legal fees and taxes, I invested in several farm improvements I had long considered but couldn't previously afford. We upgraded to a fully automated drip irrigation system that reduced water usage by 60% while improving crop yields. Solar panels now power our entire operation, making the farm carbon neutral. We constructed a modern processing facility that allowed us to expand into value-added products like preserves and sauces, creating 4 new permanent jobs for local residents. Perhaps most meaningfully, we established the Texas Agricultural Heritage Fund, a scholarship program at the local community college supporting students pursuing sustainable farming education. Each year, 5 young people receive full tuition and the opportunity to complete paid internships on our farm. 3 former scholarship recipients have already started their own small farming operations in the county. The case itself created ripples beyond our local community. The Texas Farm Bureau featured the story in their quarterly publication, bringing attention to the increasing conflicts between agricultural operations and expanding suburban development. This ultimately led to state legislative action. The Texas Farm Heritage Protection Act, signed into law 18 months after my case concluded, specifically prohibits HOAs from interfering with agricultural operations that predate their establishment and imposes triple damages for any attempts to do so. The governor held the signing ceremony on my farm, with local news cameras capturing the moment as a symbol of Texas standing up for its agricultural roots. Justice completed its perfect circle 1 year later. The same for sale sign that Patricia had imagined forcing onto my farm instead stood on her Meadowbrook estate for 11 months, ultimately selling at a 40% loss. The final buyers? A young family whose children now visit my farm stand weekly for fresh produce, and whose father, a former California tech executive who wanted his children to understand where food comes from, now volunteers during harvest season, working the same soil Patricia once tried to destroy.